The snow outside had stopped falling 3 days earlier, and that was the part that worried her most. No wind, no fresh powder. Just a hard, silent cold pressing down on the valley like something that had made up its mind. Inside the cabin, a woman knelt on the floorboards with her ear turned toward the wood, listening to a sound most people would have mistaken for the house settling. It was not the house. It was coming from underneath it. She had already moved her son's cot twice that week, first away from the north wall, then away from the window, and now, finally, toward a square she had marked into the floor with a piece of charcoal, a square that did not lead to a cellar. Not yet. Not in the way anyone in that valley would have called a cellar. Her nearest neighbor had ridden out 2 weeks before, taken one look at the shallow pit beginning to form beneath her home, and said the kind of thing people say when they believe they are being kind. She kept digging anyway. By the time the temperature outside fell to 22 degrees below zero, most families in that stretch of country would be feeding their stoves through the night, watching the gap under the door, praying the wood held out until morning. She would be somewhere else, somewhere most of them had never thought to look. Not colder, warmer. What she found in the ground beneath her own floorboards did not come from a book, and it did not come from anyone willing to teach her. It came from watching something so ordinary that almost everyone else in that valley had walked past it their whole lives without seeing it at all. This is the story of the night that difference mattered more than anything else she owned. If you're watching this from somewhere cold, tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like hers survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. There are more of them ahead. Hannah Voss counted the woodpile the way other women counted coins, because by early December, it had become the same thing. She had built the stack herself in October, working after her son Eli was asleep, stacking split logs under the eave, where the roof would keep the worst of the weather off them. She had believed at the time that it was enough. Her husband had died in the spring, thrown from a wagon on the low road, and she had spent the summer learning which chores could wait and which could not. Firewood, she had learned quickly, could not. By the first week of December, she stood in front of that same stack and did the arithmetic again, the way she had done it every few days since the first hard frost. 4 cords, maybe a little less. The stove ate through nearly half a cord in a bad week, and the worst weeks were still ahead of her, not behind. She did not say any of this out loud. Eli was 7, old enough to notice worry on a grown face, and young enough to still ask questions she did not have good answers for. That night, after he was asleep, she sat by the stove with a ledger that had nothing to do with money in it, only tally marks, one for every day the fire had to run from dusk until dawn, just to keep the frost off the inside of the windows. The marks were increasing faster than the woodpile could keep pace with. She thought about buying more wood. There was a man 2 farms over who sold cords at a price that assumed you had no choice but to pay it. She had a little money left from selling the horse in October, but not enough to last the whole winter at that price, and not enough pride left to pretend otherwise. What she needed was not more wood. She understood that clearly enough sitting there in the cold hours of the night. What she needed was a way to lose less of what she already had, because a fire that burns and immediately loses its heat to the wind and the frozen ground underneath the cabin was, in a very real sense, wood being wasted twice. She had never thought of heat as something that could be kept, the way you kept flour or salt pork. But sitting there, watching her own breath fog faintly in a room with a fire still going, she began to wonder if that was exactly the mistake she and everyone else in the valley had been making. The cabin was not failing to hold heat because the fire was too small. It was failing because the cabin was standing on top of frozen ground. And frozen ground, she was beginning to suspect, took heat the way a thief takes anything left unguarded. It was the dog that showed her first, though she did not understand what she was looking at for almost 2 more days. Scout was an old farm dog, more patient than useful most winters, and he had taken to sleeping in a spot near the northeast corner of the cabin that made no obvious sense. It was not near the stove, it was not out of the wind. If anything, it was the coldest-looking corner of the yard, tucked against the low side of the foundation where the cabin had been built into a slight rise in the land. Hannah noticed him there 3 mornings running before she thought to ask why. She knelt down one afternoon, ignoring the cold seeping through her skirt, and put her bare hand flat against the ground where the dog had been lying. It was cold, certainly. This was December in a valley that did not forgive carelessness. But it was not as cold as the exposed ground 10 feet away, where frost had turned the dirt hard as stone. She tried the same test near the barn, where the earth had been undisturbed for years, and again near the low spot by the creek, where water still moved somewhere beneath a crust of ice. Each place told her something slightly different, and none of it matched what she had always assumed, that the ground everywhere simply got as cold as the air above it, and stayed that way until spring. That was not quite true. Deeper ground, she was beginning to understand without yet having the words for it, seemed to hold on to some memory of warmer months, releasing it slowly, unevenly, long after the surface had gone hard. She thought of the spring house 2 farms over, a small stone structure built half into a hillside, where a neighbor kept milk and butter cool even in July. Everyone treated it as an ordinary convenience, a trick for keeping things cold. It had never occurred to her, until she was kneeling in the frost with her hand pressed against half-frozen dirt, that the same idea might work in reverse. If the ground below the frost line could keep things cool in summer, it might also keep something from getting quite as cold in winter, holding steadier than the air ever could. She did not have a name yet for what she was thinking. She only had a dog who kept choosing the same strange corner to sleep in, night after night, and a growing suspicion that he understood something about that ground that she had not yet allowed herself to take seriously. She rode out to see Silas Grady on a Tuesday, mostly because he was the nearest neighbor with enough years on the land to have an opinion worth hearing, and partly because she did not entirely trust her own reasoning yet, and wanted someone to either confirm it or talk her out of it. Grady had farmed that stretch of the valley for over 20 years, longer than anyone else within a half-day's ride, and he listened to her describe the dog, the ground, the spring house comparison, with the careful, unhurried attention of a man deciding how much of what he heard was worth taking seriously. When she finished, he did not laugh, which she appreciated, but he did not agree with her either. "You're talking about digging under your own house," he said, "in December, with frozen ground and a boy depending on you, based on where a dog likes to nap." He was not wrong to be skeptical, and she knew it. He reminded her that a shallow dig in half-frozen soil could shift unevenly as the ground thawed and refroze through the winter, that a room dug too close to the foundation without proper support could undermine the cabin itself, and that even if she was right about the ground holding warmth, cutting into it wrong could just as easily let cold and damp pool in a hole she had no way to heat. "Men with more hands than you have tried less and lost more," he said, not unkindly. She rode home with his warnings sitting heavier in her chest than she wanted to admit. He had given her real reasons, not the kind she could simply decide to ignore. A collapse would not just cost her time, it could cost her the cabin itself, or worse. But riding past her own woodpile again, counting it without meaning to, she thought about the alternative he had not mentioned outright, the quiet arithmetic of running out of wood in February, with no way to buy more, and a boy who would still be cold no matter how carefully she rationed what was left. Grady's caution was reasonable. Her woodpile's arithmetic was also reasonable. They could not both be the safer choice. She did not announce it to anyone. There was no dramatic moment, no declaration made in front of witnesses. She simply walked out to the northeast corner of the cabin the next morning with a shovel, a mattock, and a square of charcoal she used to mark a rough outline in the frost-hardened dirt. Eli watched her from the doorway for a long moment before asking if she was digging a new root cellar. "Something like that," she told him, which was true in the way that a half answer can still be honest. She chose the spot carefully, not directly under the cabin's main floor, where disturbing the foundation risked exactly what Grady had warned her about, but along the low side, where the ground already sloped downward into the rise the cabin had been built against. It was the same corner Scout had claimed for himself, the same ground that had felt different under her palm 3 days before. The first strike of the mattock told her almost nothing. The ground gave the way frozen ground gives, reluctantly, in small, stubborn pieces. She measured her progress not in feet, but in the ache settling into her shoulders by mid-morning. She thought, more than once that first day, about Grady's warning, about hands she did not have, about a boy who was watching her dig into ground that could, if she misjudged it, fail exactly the way he said it might. She kept digging anyway, not because she was certain she was right, but because she had run the numbers on her woodpile more times than she could count. And every version of that arithmetic ended the same way in February. By the time the light failed that afternoon, she had cleared perhaps 8 inches of frozen soil across a space no larger than a small room, and she stood at the edge of it, looking down into a shallow scar in the earth that did not yet resemble a shelter of any kind. It resembled a decision. Nothing more than that yet, but it was hers, and she intended to see where it led. The second day was harder than the first, which she had not expected. She had assumed the ground would soften as she went deeper, the way frost was supposed to loosen below the surface. Instead, she hit a tangle of roots from the old cottonwood near the fence line, thick fingers of wood that had spread further under the yard than she had ever imagined a tree reaching. Eli helped where a 7-year-old could help, hauling loosened dirt in a bucket to a pile well clear of the opening, and she found herself grateful for the company more than the labor, though she would not have said so out loud. The days were short now. Barely 8 hours of usable light between a sunrise that arrived reluctantly and a dusk that seemed to arrive early out of spite. She worked until her hands lost feeling inside her gloves, then worked a little longer, because every hour spent digging was an hour she was not spending feeding a fire that could not keep up. By the 4th day, the shallow scar in the earth had become something closer to a pit, roughly waist-deep in most places, deeper where the roots had forced her to cut around rather than through them. She had not yet reached the layer of soil that had felt different under her palm that first afternoon, the layer that stayed steady no matter what the sky was doing above it. Her shoulders ached in a way that no longer faded overnight. Her hands had split at the knuckles from cold and repeated friction, and she had started wrapping them in strips of old flannel before picking up the mattock each morning. A small daily ritual that Eli watched without comment. She thought, more than once, about how much faster this would go with another set of hands, an idea she did not allow herself to dwell on for long. There was no one to ask. Grady had already told her what he thought, and the rest of the valley had either not heard yet or had chosen, kindly or otherwise, to stay out of it. What kept her moving was not confidence. It was the woodpile, shrinking a little more each week, whether or not she finished in time, and the growing certainty that whatever waited beneath that frozen ground, it could not possibly be worse than doing nothing at all. On the 5th day, the mattock struck something that wasn't root and was not ordinary soil. She cleared the dirt away carefully, expecting stone, and found instead a shallow seam of pale, dense clay running at a slight angle beneath where she had been digging. It was nothing like the dark topsoil above it. Heavier, almost slick when she worked it between her fingers, and cool in a way that felt different from the surrounding earth. She had seen clay like this only once before, in a creek bank 2 miles east, where her husband had once pointed out a similar seam and mentioned, almost in passing, that the old trapper who'd first worked this stretch of the valley had lined a spring house wall with something just like it. Finding the seam changed her plan in a way she had not anticipated. She had intended to simply dig a room and shore the walls with timber, the way she imagined any root cellar might be built. But the clay suggested something else, a way to line at least part of the chamber with material that would not simply crumble the way loose, frozen dirt eventually would. There was also a problem the clay revealed rather than solved. Where the seam ran closest to the surface, on the northern edge of her dig, the ground felt faintly damp even through the frost, suggesting water moved somewhere below, slow and shallow, the way it sometimes did in low ground near a creek. She stood at the edge of the pit, turning this over. A layer that could seal and insulate a wall was valuable. A hidden path for water beneath a shelter she intended to shelter her son in during the worst of the winter was not something she could afford to ignore. She would need to work around it, not through it, angling the deepest part of the room away from that damp northern edge, rather than digging straight down the way she had originally planned. It cost her another full day of reworking ground she had already cleared, digging a redirection rather than continuing forward. And it was the first moment since she'd started that she truly understood how much she still did not know about what she was building. The wall gave way on the 7th night, though she did not discover it until the following morning. She had shored the western side of the pit with a rough frame of split timber the day before, more out of instinct than any real knowledge of how such supports were meant to be built. It had held through one full night. It did not hold through the second, a night when the temperature dropped sharply and the ground around the excavation shifted as the top layer of soil refroze harder than before. She found nearly a third of the western wall collapsed inward, timber and frozen dirt scattered across the floor of the chamber she had spent the better part of a week clearing. For a long moment she simply stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at several days of work undone in the space of one cold night. This was, almost exactly, what Silas Grady had warned her about. She allowed herself perhaps an hour of sitting with that thought before making herself climb down into the wreckage to look closer, because sitting with it any longer would not put the wall back together. What she found, once she cleared the fallen dirt away, was instructive in a way the intact wall had never been. The collapse had not happened evenly. It had failed along a single seam, near the base, where she had packed the timber supports tightly against undisturbed frozen soil without leaving any space for that soil to shift as it expanded and contracted with the cold. The wall had not failed because timber shoring was the wrong idea. It had failed because she had built it as though the ground around it would simply stay still, when the truth, the collapse now made clear, was that frozen ground moved more than she had ever given it credit for, swelling and settling with every hard freeze and shallow thaw. She thought of Eli's cot, still sitting untouched above the marked square in the cabin floor, and of how close that same failure might come to happening on a night when someone was actually inside. She rebuilt the western wall differently, though it took her most of a day simply to work out how. Instead of packing the timber frame tight against the surrounding earth, she left a narrow gap, no wider than a hand's width, between the shoring and the undisturbed soil, filling that gap loosely with smaller stones and looser dirt rather than tamping everything down hard. The idea, half remembered from watching her husband repair a stone fence years earlier, was to give the ground somewhere to shift into as it froze and thawed, rather than forcing that movement directly against a rigid wall with nowhere to go. She tested it on a smaller section first, a short stretch near the southern corner, rather than risking the whole wall a second time. Eli sat nearby, less to help than to watch. And it was Scout, oddly enough, who offered the clearest sign that something had changed. The dog, who had shown no interest in the pit itself throughout the entire dig, climbed partway down the earthen steps on the 8th morning and settled against the newly rebuilt section of wall. The same unhurried, deliberate choice he had made outside the cabin weeks before. She did not fully trust a dog's judgment as proof of anything, but she noted it anyway, the way she had learned to note every small, unexplained signal since this whole strange effort began. 3 days passed without further collapse. The rebuilt section held through 2 more hard freezes, through the kind of temperature swings that had brought the first wall down. It was not, she understood, final proof of anything. A few days of good weather, relatively speaking, was not the same as surviving the worst the valley could offer. But it was the first evidence she had that failure was not the end of the idea. It was information the ground had given her, and she had, this time, actually listened to what it was trying to say. By the middle of the following week, the chamber was finally something more than a hole in the ground. She had lined the walls with the clay seam, where it reached far enough, packed the timber shoring the way the rebuilt section had taught her, and laid a rough plank floor over the packed earth to keep the worst of the ground moisture away from anything or anyone resting inside. It was not finished. The ceiling was still a temporary arrangement of boards laid across the opening, covered with a thin layer of straw and dirt for insulation. Nothing like the sealed roof she still intended to build. But on a night when the temperature outside fell to a genuinely uncomfortable cold, colder than anything since she'd started digging, she decided it was enough to test. She brought a single blanket down into the chamber after Eli was asleep upstairs, not willing yet to move him without knowing what she would find, and sat alone in the dark for the better part of an hour with her back against the clay-lined wall. The difference was not dramatic. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. It was not warm, not in any sense that would have impressed someone stepping in from a heated room, but it was steadier. The cold did not bite the way it did upstairs near the window, did not carry the same restless edge that came from wind finding its way through gaps in log walls. It simply sat there, even and unmoving, the way the air in a cellar sits in August. She climbed back up before dawn, cold but not nearly as cold as she had expected to be, and stood for a long moment looking at Eli asleep in his cot, still positioned above the marked square in the floor. It was one mild test on one moderately hard night. It told her nothing about what would happen if the temperature dropped far beyond anything she had felt so far. But it told her the idea itself was not foolish, and after weeks of digging, correcting, and doubting, that alone felt like more than she'd had in a long time. The first real sign came from the animals, the way it usually did in that valley, though most people noticed it too late to matter. Grady's cattle, visible from her yard on clear days, had bunched tightly along the leeward side of his barn for 2 mornings running, refusing to spread out across the field the way they normally would. Scout had stopped wanting to go outside at all, except briefly, and even then he moved with his head low and his ears flattened in a way she had learned over the years to take seriously. The sky itself offered its own warning by the 3rd afternoon, a strange yellowish cast to the light in the west that old-timers in the valley called a sign that something large was building. Still distant, but building all the same. She had perhaps 2 days, she guessed. Maybe 3 if she was fortunate. The chamber below the cabin still needed its ceiling properly sealed, the makeshift boards and straw replaced with something that would actually hold against real weight and real cold, and she had not yet built any way to move heat down into the space beyond simply occupying it with body warmth and blankets. She worked through both remaining days with an urgency that left little room for doubt, because doubt was a luxury that belonged to earlier in the process. Not now. She sealed the ceiling with a heavier layer of packed earth and straw, thick enough to hold, she hoped, against the weight of accumulating snow. She ran a short length of stovepipe salvaged from an old, unused heater down through a narrow shaft cut into the corner of the chamber, not for warmth exactly, but to give the space a way to vent, a way to keep stale, damp air from settling and turning the shelter into something worse than the cold itself. By the second evening, the wind had already picked up, carrying the first fine grains of snow sideways past the cabin windows. She stood at the top of the earthen steps leading down into the chamber and understood, in the plain, unglamorous way that real understanding usually arrives, that whatever she had built was about to be tested by exactly the thing she had built it for. Chapter 11. 22 degrees below zero. The blizzard reached the valley just after midnight, and it did not arrive gently. Wind found every seam in the cabin's log walls that Hannah had spent years learning to live with, seams that had always been merely uncomfortable, and now felt, for the first time, genuinely dangerous. The stove worked as hard as she could safely push it, and still the temperature near the windows dropped past anything she had felt inside that cabin before. Eli began coughing sometime before 2 in the morning, a dry, persistent cough that worried her more than the cold itself did. He was not sick. Not exactly. Not yet. But a small body working too hard to stay warm through a long night was its own kind of danger, one she had watched claim children in that valley before, in winters less severe than this one was shaping up to be. She made the decision without much debate left in her, though the debate had, in truth, occupied her mind for the entire 6 weeks leading up to this exact night. She wrapped Eli in every blanket the cabin owned, carried him down the earthen steps into the chamber that was still, by any fair measure, unfinished, and settled him against the clay-lined wall she had rebuilt weeks before, after its first collapse. The difference was immediate in a way the earlier test had only hinted at. The wind that had been screaming through the cabin above them barely reached down into the chamber at all, its violence absorbed somewhere in the packed earth and timber overhead. The cold, when she pressed her palm against the wall the way she had that very first afternoon with the dog, was still there, but distant, patient. Nothing like the sharp, biting cold pouring through the cabin's window seams. Eli's coughing eased within the hour, not because anything had cured him, but because his body was no longer spending everything it had simply fighting to stay warm. Hannah did not sleep that night. She sat beside her son in the dim light of a single lantern, listening to a storm that outside would have been howling, muffled here into something closer to a distant, indifferent murmur, and she waited. The way she had waited through 6 weeks of digging and doubting, to see if the morning would prove her right. The blizzard held through the following day, and into a second night before finally breaking, leaving snowdrifts against the north side of the cabin taller than Hannah herself. She and Eli emerged from the chamber on the 3rd morning to a valley gone completely white and eerily silent, the way it always did after a storm that size. Eli, exhausted but steady on his feet, asked if they could go back down that night too, a question she had not expected, and one that told her, more than any measurement could have, that something about those 2 nights had felt safe to him rather than frightening. Word of the storm's severity traveled through the valley over the following days, the way it always did. Families comparing losses, comparing damage, comparing how close each household had come to real trouble. When Silas Grady rode out to check on her, a courtesy he extended to most of his neighbors after a storm like that, he did not immediately ask about the pit he had once warned her against. He asked instead how Eli was doing. She told him plainly, without pride and without apology, and led him to the entrance of the chamber himself. He climbed down, said little at first, and pressed his own palm against the clay-lined wall the way she had that very first afternoon, weeks earlier. He did not offer an apology for his earlier warnings, and she did not expect one. His caution had been reasonable, built from years of watching poorly planned shelters fail in exactly the ways he had described. What he offered instead, before riding home that afternoon, was a quiet observation that his own root cellar, dug decades earlier on flatter, unremarkable ground, had never held heat the way this one seemed to. By the following winter, 2 other families in the valley had dug similar chambers into the low sides of their own homes. Neither of them exact copies of Hannah's, each adjusted to whatever their own ground happened to hide beneath the frost line. The shelter itself was never anything remarkable to look at. A plain earthen room with a clay-lined wall and a short length of salvaged stovepipe. It never appeared in any record beyond what the families who built one chose to remember and pass along. What it had done, on one particular night when the temperature outside fell to 22 degrees below zero, was give a frightened woman and her coughing son somewhere to wait out a storm that had every intention of taking something from them. It had not been about the wood at all, not really. It had been about giving the winter fewer places left to reach them. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.